In many stories, the concubines were taken by force and sold into their life, but this was not always the case. It was not uncommon in some cultures for poorer families to present their daughters to a ruler in order to see if they would be chosen as a concubine. This often served the dual purpose of getting rid of an extra mouth to feed, as well as giving their daughter a life of comfort, privilege, and protection. In this episode, we discuss the secret life of an ancient concubine. Across numerous ancient cultures and religious practices, it was common for rulers and esteemed members of society to have both wives and concubines. Concubines played a multifaceted role, often aimed at enhancing a man's status by bearing children and fulfilling his desires. While many may immediately think of ancient China, where emperors famously maintained vast numbers of concubines, it's essential to recognize that the practice wasn't confined to China alone. The practice of taking a concubine goes back thousands of years to the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia and Babylonia, where the elite members of society took concubines, many of whom were slaves. However, the first wife always retained a place of primacy in the family. In some city-states, women served as priestesses and held a very high social rank. Generally, these women did not marry. In some Mesopotamian cultures, men would visit these women as prostitutes, which society not only condoned, but considered an honorable fulfillment of religious duty, regardless of the marital status of the man. Concubines appeared in the Bible as well. The Israelites often kept concubines in addition to their wives. Wives had dowries, but concubines did not, and this was the chief method of distinguishing between the two social positions. One of the most famous keepers of concubines in the Bible was King Solomon, who was said to have 300 concubines in addition to his 700 wives. While concubinage is not acceptable in Christianity today, some Bible commentators have suggested that God allowed men to have more than one wife or several concubines during the period from the Great Flood until the Old Covenant in order to build up the world's population. In Judaism, concubines are known as pilagesh, a term meaning a mistress staying in the house in Hebrew. According to the Babylonian Talmud, the distinction between a concubine and a full wife lay in the formalities surrounding their unions. While a wife would receive a marriage contract and undergo a formal betrothal, these were not required for a concubine. Some Jewish scholars, like Maimonides, maintained that concubines were exclusively reserved for kings, prohibiting commoners from having concubines. They argued that individuals outside of royalty should refrain from any form of sexual relations outside of marriage. In Islam, the practice of taking concubines was also permitted. Chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran outlines that a man may marry up to 4 women, provided he can treat them justly. If concubinage was considered acceptable as a social need only under certain guidelines. In ancient times, 2 sources for concubines were permitted under an Islamic regime. Primarily, non-Muslim women taken as prisoners of war were made concubines, as happened after the Battle of Bani Qurayza. Alternately, in ancient pagan times, sale and purchase of human slaves was a socially legal exercise. However, on embracing Islam, it was encouraged to free slave women or bring them into formal marriage. It is calculated that the Prophet Muhammad married a total of 15 women, though only ever 11 at one time, and had at least 4 concubines. All of Muhammad's concubines were his slaves. According to records, Muhammad used to visit all 11 of his wives in one night. In ancient Greece, the practice of keeping a slave concubine was little recorded but appears throughout Athenian history. Law prescribed that a man could kill another man caught attempting a relationship with his concubine for the production of free children, which suggests that a concubine's children were not granted citizenship. Under Roman law, concubinage was tolerated as the relationship was durable and exclusive. The practice allowed a Roman man to enter into an informal but recognized relationship with a woman who was not his wife. Most often a woman whose lower social status was an obstacle to marriage. A concubinus was a young male slave chosen by his master as a sexual partner. Romans did not mark same-sex relations as homosexual if an adult male used a slave or prostitute, characteristically a youth, as his passive partner. These relations, however, were expected to play a secondary role in marriage, within which institution an adult male demonstrated his masculine authority as head of the household. He cannot maintain justice among plural wives. He is advised to marry only one woman or to rely on his slave woman. In ancient China, concubinage operated as a complex system where concubines were meticulously ranked based on their favor with the emperor. The circumstances of concubines varied widely, ranging from those treated akin to respected wives to others relegated to the status of mistreated individuals akin to prostitutes. A concubine's status could improve significantly by bearing an heir, albeit their offspring would still hold an inferior position compared to legitimate children. Their ascent up the social hierarchy was largely contingent upon the emperor's favor. An illustrative case is that of Consort Wu, the favored concubine of Emperor Xuanzong of China. Renowned for her beauty, she attained the highest possible rank for a concubine. Following the death of the emperor's wife in 724 CE, Consort Wu was accorded empress-like treatment by all palace servants. However, not all concubines shared in such fortune. Those who failed to produce offspring often found their lives becoming increasingly unpleasant. The Chinese emperors kept concubines with them in the Forbidden City, and by the Qing dynasty, there were around 20,000. The imperial concubines were guarded by an equally obscene number of eunuchs to ensure that they couldn't be made pregnant by anybody except the emperor. The internal hierarchy was firm and inflexible, and consorts would fiercely guard their unofficial ranking and do virtually anything to advance. Jealousy and bickering between concubines was rampant, and ensured that daily life was far from a life of pleasant leisure. Spending a night with the emperor was hard to come by due to the high number of consorts available, so concubines would compete vehemently against each other. While in the service of the palace, no concubine was allowed to communicate with the outside world, not in person and not even by mail. This ban went so far as to not allow a doctor to enter the palace and see a sick concubine. Her illness would be described and prescriptions acquired and administered according to the doctor's advice. But there were some situations in which a concubine would leave the palace. Just like the emperor could receive a consort as a gift from a foreign ruler, so could the emperor choose to present one of his concubines as a gift to a foreign ruler. It could, however, be argued that one prison had merely been replaced by another. During the Ming dynasty, some consorts were granted the opportunity to return to their families after years of service, receiving a suitable pension. The Hongwu emperor established a minimum service period of 5 years in 1389. Upon retirement, these consorts were free to pursue ordinary lives, including marriage and starting families. Some elderly consorts, no longer valuable to the imperial palace, opted to remain employed there as maids or chose a religious life as nuns. However, a less glamorous aspect of concubinage was the reality that consorts were viewed as the personal property of the ruler, subject to his whims even in death. Many older noble tombs contain the remains of multiple females of similar ages, buried alongside a single man, a stark indication of concubinage. Imperial consorts often met grim fates, either executed by palace eunuchs or choosing to end their lives through suicide, typically by hanging or poisoning themselves with a silk scarf. In the early Ming dynasty, concubines were frequently immolated and buried in separate tombs near the deceased emperor. In some extreme cases, consorts were buried alive in a standing position, symbolically awaiting the emperor's arrival in the afterlife. China's last concubine. As China's last imperial consort, Li Yuqin was enslaved from the age of 15. This was back in 1943, when Puyi's empress, Wan Rong, was all but destroyed by opium. His first concubine had divorced him, and a second concubine had died in mysterious circumstances. The emperor's minders decided that Pu Yi needed a new consort, and he was invited to take his pick from photographs of local schoolgirls. He chose Li Yuqin, who was plucked from her home and told she was going to the palace to learn and study. The young girl did not realize what awaited her. "Because I thought I went there to study, I even took my school bag. I was very innocent then, thinking I could flee back if I didn't like it. In fact, it was absolutely impossible to escape," said Li Yuqin. Lish remained benevolent in her judgment of Pu Yi, who was finally released from prison in 1959 and sent to work in Peking's botanical gardens until he died, childless, of cancer in 1967. Pu Yi has many aspects. He was timid, suspicious, irritable. But as a human being, he also suffered a lot of pain and misery, much heavier than the common people's, she said. Li Yuqin was the last female consort of the final emperor of China. In the vast tapestry of African history, the institution of concubinage stands as a complex facet, weaving through the fabric of society with intricacy and nuance. Contrary to popular belief, concubinage in ancient Africa was not merely a tale of exploitation and oppression, but a multifaceted institution shaped by cultural, social, and economic factors. Concubinage, the practice of cohabitation between a man and a woman without formal marriage, has deep roots in ancient African cultures. Its origins can be traced back to various factors, including traditional customs, economic considerations, and political alliances. In many African societies, polygyny, the practice of a man having multiple wives, was prevalent, and concubinage often emerged as a complementary institution. One of the primary catalysts for the establishment of concubinage was the need for alliances between different tribes or clans. Powerful leaders often solidified political or military alliances by taking women from other communities as concubines. These unions served as symbols of unity and cooperation, fostering peace and stability in volatile regions. Moreover, economic considerations played a significant role in the practice of concubinage. In agrarian societies where labor was essential for sustenance and prosperity, the presence of concubines expanded the workforce available to a household. Concubines often engaged in agricultural activities, domestic chores, or artisanal work, contributing to the economic productivity of the household. The institution of concubinage had far-reaching implications for the social dynamics and structures of ancient African societies. While its effects varied across different cultures and regions, several common themes emerge when examining its impact. Concubinage reinforced existing social hierarchies by delineating relationships based on status and lineage. Concubines occupied a subordinate position compared to wives in polygynous households, with their rights and privileges often limited. This hierarchical arrangement mirrored broader societal divisions, perpetuating inequalities based on gender, class, and ethnicity. The practice of concubinage facilitated cultural exchange and integration between diverse communities.